thanks very much for coming, everybody. It's great to see you. Very pleased to welcome today Ivo Lars from Antwerp. He's director of the Herman de Leek Center for Social Policy, chair of the Department of Sociology in the past for a while. He's done the jobs. He's multidisciplinary, sounds like us, degrees in political and social sciences and in economics. Lots of professional service of the sort that we would be aware of, like on the editorial boards of Social Forces, Journal of Social Policy, Social Inclusion and European Policy Analysis. He's on the board of Esponet and so on. He does impact, well, at least dissemination. He's columnist for Die Standaard, which is, Belgium's newspapers. That's the, I don't know, Guardian equivalent, maybe? Yeah. It's not Telegram. He does a lot on minimum income and poverty, and this talk is going to be about that. And there's loads of publications in this area. Very timely. His talk is on Zero Poverty Society, How to Lift the Social Floor. The original title was Adequate Minimum Income Protection, How Can It Be Done? But it's sort of the same thing. Right? It's the same thing. And I invited him along specially because today is the day that the Department of Work and Pensions in the UK has just released the latest poverty statistics of average income. And the proportion of people who is poor has just gone up, at least from an anchored measure. And we're going to have solutions, right?
I hope so.
Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Stephen, for the introduction. Thank you for inviting me back in my beloved London. I'm happy to see so many people. I was here, last time I was here was in January 2022, over a year ago, and then it was eerily empty, but now it's full of people again. After this. Yeah, I changed the title just a little bit because the original title sounded a bit too boring, I thought. So I wanted to juice it up a bit. Close a new title, but basically it is still about minimum income protection, and it's going to be a fairly broad-ranging talk. So it's not about one research question, and it's not going to be very focused. It's present some analysis from the book. And the book builds in part on our own empirical analysis, but also on our reading of the literature. I think that together with Sarah Marchal have been working on the topic for 30 years almost, and I thought it's time to make a bit of a summing up. So what I think have I learned from all that research? So basically it's about minimum income protection, minimum income floors. How can we make sure that people have adequate minimum resources to have a life in dignity, to live free of poverty? That is basically the very simple question to address. So where do we stand? And the focus will be mostly on Europe, also a bit on North America, the US. So where does it stand? Why is it so low? Yes, that part is very inadequate. Why is that? And how can we do that? So that's basically it. Okay, very quickly, I'm going to run through this very fast, but just as a quick reminder of what policy thinking is, because there has been, I think, a major shift, especially after the financial crisis and with COVID. I think it has more saliency now. I think the issue has become more important. But we know very fast that there was a big expansion, of course, after the Second World War, fast expansion of social insurance and healthcare provisions. Many countries introduced final safety nets, and that's going to be a main focus of the talk in the 1960s and 70s. Then we had the energy price shocks, déjà vu, of course, nowadays, which plunged the world into a recession. Unemployment went up. Social spending went up. There was talk about the crisis of the welfare state and spending going to levels that were not sustainable. And even then, at that time, talking about the rise of neoliberalism in the 1980s, the welfare state became almost seen as a co-culprit of what was happening. And there were people arguing I think the OECD and various also academics are writing that over generous benefits and over-regulation and strong unions and so on, that was in part to blame. It was part of it. Good. There's a big shift, as we know, in the 1990s. Then remember, Bill Clinton, almost 30 years, more than 30 years now, runs on the slogan to end welfare as we know it, basically acknowledging one of the critiques of one of the strongest critiques was formulated by Charles Murray. Probably come across that name. I wrote the book Losing Ground in the 1980s, which was very influential. And basically, Clinton and the Democrats accepted that critique and say we need a strong shift from providing just welfare to putting people to work. And so there was a big reform in US welfare, basically the abolishment of AFDC, which had existed since the 1930s. And at the same time, there was an expansion of the EITC, the Earned Income Tax Credit. And so the idea was less benefits for people who are not working. We should get people into work, and then we should reward them with these tax credits. Same story in Europe. Of course, Tony Blair, 1990s, runs on the third way. In Europe, we have the active welfare state doctrines. And basically, the slogan becomes jobs, jobs, jobs. And also very much the idea that jobs will do the job. If we get more people in work, poverty will come down. We will have more social cohesion. There will be less social exclusion. And so very example of that was the fact that at the EU level in the strategic agendas they had, that there were very clear employment targets, and that was what Europe people work, but there were no poverty or social exclusion. Basically, the assumption was that one thing would automatically bring that job. If you get more people at work, poverty will come down, and we'll have more social integration and so forth. Before the financial crisis, the pendulum was almost, there was a very influential report in the early 2000s by Espinosa, Duncan Galley, Anton Himbrek, and John Miles. And they were, of course, the big advocates and proponents of social investment. We should again move away from giving people benefits, cash transfers. We need, as it says here, a reallocation of social expenditures towards family services, active labor market policy, early childhood education, vocational training, and so on. So benefits, minimum income protection at that time was almost out of the picture. Putting it a bit strongly, perhaps, you get the gist. So we already knew then, at that time, during the 1980s, 1990s, and 2000, there was actually strong employment growth. Should not forget, during that time, there was a massive increase in employment in some countries. It's like Spain had incredible increases in employment rates. But we were becoming clear that those increases in employment were not bringing down poverty. There were various reasons for that. It's not the core topic of the talk, but one reason was that these jobs didn't go primarily to people who needed them most. But basically, whenever there was employment growth, you saw often an increase in households going from one earner households to dual earner households, but there was not a proportionate reduction in the number of households without a job. Both Rank and Jonathan Wadsworth in the 1990s were the first to look at what is happening at the individual level in terms of employment, what is happening at the household level, and there can be big differences there. You can have an increase in the individual employment rate, and at the same time, you can have stagnant household joblessness at the household level. At the same time, as I said, there was a bit of neglect of passive income protection. And that was neglected. It was not that there was actual cutbacks and that things were actually actively broken down. But if you don't upgrade benefits, if you don't keep them in line with what is happening with wages and the prices, yeah, then you have in effect an erosion, even if you're not making cuts in this. And another issue came to the fore, and that was the issue of in-work poverty. And that was something alien in EU discourse, I think, roughly until the 1990s. That the idea was the working poor. That's something you find in America, but that's not something that exists in Europe. And it was becoming clear from empirical research that that was very much not true. And most European countries also had working people. Good. Then I think there's a new dawn. Then things change, and things change after the financial crisis. That was, as I call it here, a bit of a wake-up call. I think there was a realization that then, because a number of countries very hard hit. We know the story of what happened in the aftermath of the financial crisis. Unemployment going up, youth unemployment going up, and it was becoming very clear that social safety nets and good, of course, unemployment insurance resources that those matter. And you see minimum income protection regaining some prominence in this. So you see it in European Parliament resolutions and in other documents. So there is a realization that we need adequate social safety nets, and that was especially that became at its strongest when. Remember Greece, of course, a massive drop, a massive collapse of the economy, and we had headlines like this in the New York Times: more children in Greece are going hungry. At the same time, you have the Troika going in and saying we need to do cuts in your welfare programs. But at the same time, there was a realization at the EU level also with what was happening. Of course, politically in Greece, with a big anti-EU or an anti-austerity party winning big, that there needs to be a shift. And it was Juncker, and Juncker, you must know, is a social democratic, is a Christian democratic politician from Luxembourg, very much someone who was brought up in a country that valued social consultation and social dialogue. And strong unions and a strong welfare state. And Juncker recognized that. He said, EU needs to be triple social A. And that was, of course, a reference to all these people also within the Commission and within what was then called the Troika, who were obsessed with the ratings by the Moody's and pictures of this book. And that was not just talk. And so in 2017, very much under the impetus of Juncker, the EU launches a pillar of social rights. And that pillar consists of a number of principles that are basically undersigned by all EU member states. So you can say these are only words, and these are only intentions, and these are only principles, and this is not hard law. But the fact that you got all EU member states to undersign these principles was not politically so self-evident. That was a major step, and very prominent, of course, from the story today is Principle 14. Everyone lacking sufficient resources has the right to adequate minimum income benefits, ensuring a life in dignity at all stages in life. That's the topic. So, where do we stand? These are the words. Where do we stand? We know that most EU countries have now social safety nets. Some countries introduced these as long ago as the 1960s and the 1970s. So most countries have social safety nets that consist of means and sometimes often asset-tested cash benefits that ensure a minimum living standard. Italy, Spain, Greece only introduced these schemes only a couple of years ago. Years later, And so further characteristics are that benefit levels and eligibility criteria are generally laid down in law. And so people have a legal right to financial support or to minimum income support. It is codified in law, but there's also often a lot of local discretion. And that local discretion, the fact that bureaucrats, so caseworkers, have a level of discretion is something that goes away because you cannot capture every situation in rules, and you need people making a judgment, which is especially important when it comes to final safety net benefits of last resort. And there's a balance that to be struck. I'll talk about it. And of course, these benefits are not or rarely unconditional. So people are supposed to work or to look for work, to accept jobs, or to engage in training. And in some countries, they are actually made to sign contracts to that effect. So where are we now in terms of minimum income protection? And this shows you where we stand. So this builds on model family type research. So what you do is you define a couple of model families. You look at a single person, you look at a single parent with 2 children, you look at a couple. And so you predefine some situations and you look at what are people legally entitled to. So what do they get on paper in terms of social assistance, in terms of child benefits, in terms of tax credits, but also you look, do they have to pay social contributions, do they have to pay taxes? And so you try to gauge what is the minimum income level that people are entitled to. You can say this is just a paper reality. Not everybody gets what they're entitled to. On the other hand, people may get additional benefits that are more discretionary or that only apply in certain cases. So it doesn't provide perhaps the full picture, but at least it does, at minimum, gives you an idea of what people are entitled to on paper. Now, the striking thing here is, don't look at the details. This shows the situation for a single person and for a couple with 2 kids. That all these minimum income packages, so we're talking about minimum income, are way below the poverty. So this red line is the relative poverty. And we'll have a long debate about poverty measurement. I only have 1 hour to see nothing, so we don't have the whole afternoon. So we can come back to that during the discussion. I'm going to use the relative poverty line. I think it's for practical purposes. Good measure, it's not a perfect measure, it's a good measure. And of course, that relative poverty line, 60% of the median, as you know. You see that in most countries, minimum incomes are not below the poverty line, but way below. So, obvious question is, why is it? Plus, very briefly, take-up of minimum income benefits tends to be very low. So there's a big problem of non-take-up. Some studies estimate non-take-up to be as high as 50, 60, even 70%. And why is that? Variety of reasons. Often the rules are very complex. It's hard to understand. People have to go through often intrusive, demeaning, or what they experience as stigmatizing application procedures. And so these are reasons why people do not take up the benefits they're entitled to. And also there's a lot of rule complexity. There's one perhaps telling anecdote. There was a peer review or a structured dialogue, something organized by the European Commission just before COVID in Malta. And so they had brought together civil servants and academics and high-ranking civil servants, people who were the director general of social assistance or whatever in their countries. And so they sat around the table and they had to discuss stuff. And so people were asking each other questions. So how does it work with the needs test in your country? And do you take assets into account? And so these people at the table who were the director generals often didn't know what the rules were. and then they had to look for their documentation on their laptops, and they often either failed to find what the rules were. And so if these people don't fail to find what people are actually entitled to, imagine what people actually need the benefits quickly are facing. So, and for that reason, you will find that the actual relationship between the level of minimum income protection and observed poverty outcomes is relatively weak. There is a relationship. So if you, this shows you the average minimum income package as measured through that family, the model family type approach, as I just showed, and observed poverty outcome. You see, and of course, given that in most instances, the minimum income benefits or minimum income benefit packages are way below the poverty line, it's perhaps not surprising that you don't find a very clear relationship with the 60% poverty line, but even if you use the 40% poverty line, it's not that, the relationship is not that strong. It's there, but it is relatively weak. Non-take-up and such issues, I think, play an important role. So why is minimum income protection so inadequate? That's a very fascinating question. So one hypothesis is that politicians are cynics. Obviously, they are in the country of Boris and Brexit. Of course, politicians are perhaps a bit cynical. And they often talk about about reducing poverty or eliminating poverty. But when you talk to them, they also say, yeah, listen, our voters want us to show a big, warm heart. We talk with empathy about things like poverty and social exclusion until the moment that we increase taxes or we take all these nice little middle-class prices. Then the voters all of a sudden don't like it that much. So they basically say, we may be cynics, but our voters perhaps aren't. So the hypothesis too, better poverty relief is far too expensive. So it would be far too expensive to lift everybody to the poverty threshold. Now, if you do a back of the envelope calculation of what it would cost to close the poverty gap, you know what percentage of GDP that would take in a country like the UK? Yes. It's not 5. No, it's not even 5. It's in the order of 1 or 2% of GDP. It is actually a very small number. I think in the Netherlands it's 0.5% of GDP. So that's not negligible. It's not a small number, but it's also not outside of the realm of what is imaginable. If there is political will, you can find 1% of GDP. Of course, it's not as simple. Hypothesis 3, perhaps there are other spending priorities like social investment. There is some evidence that there has been a shift, but that's not the major explanation. And then there is hypothesis 4, which is a more interesting one, is that there are more fundamental constraints to lifting the social floor. And the argument runs more or less as follows. We have an incomes hierarchy, and at the very bottom sits the final safety net, say social assistance. And it is the lowest income below which you cannot fall. Over that, a bit higher up in the hierarchy, are minimum benefits within contributory schemes, where people, like unemployment insurance, disability insurance, pension schemes, and so on, where people work, pay contributions, and get benefits proportional to how long they have contributed and how much. Now you understand that when you lift this social assistance, then people will say, yeah, but I've contributed for 20 years to unemployment insurance. I want something, I want a larger benefit. So if people get the same benefit without having to do anything for it, or without having contributed. So there has to be some gap there. And then, of course, you have minimum wages. And again, it's a kind of accepted principle that being in work should pay more or give you more money than not being in work. So living on a benefit. So there has to be also, for plain reasons of work incentives, there has to be a bit of a gap here. And then you have the other wages, and you can have a long debate how much wage dispersion is possible in an economy and how high minimum wages can be. But again, people who have more experience, have more training or more education, will of course, if you live the minimum wage, the person who has worked in a job for 20 years, or has more experience, will also want an increase, so you will often have it. So then the big question is, of course, where is the poverty line? If the poverty line is here, it's okay. If the poverty line is here, that's becoming more complicated, because not only you have to push up this, but there are likely to be second further round effects here. Yeah, and if the poverty line is here, you're going to top. Another implication of that is that adequacy of minimum income protection is hard to maintain when living standards are outpacing wage growth, because you have that hierarchy. So you have minimum income level, you have the minimum wage, you have the other wages. But what happens if your living standards outpace your wage growth, which is easily possible? When living standards are going up, because more households are going from one single earner households to double earner households, you can have flat wages or no real wage growth. But if there's more employment and more second earners, you will see living standards rise. And so what happens, of course, the poverty line goes in line with the median of equivalized household income. You can easily see, and perhaps there's also household size plays a role, non-labor income plays a role. So that's all quite possible that happens. And then you go from a situation where you have potential adequacy when the poverty line is here to a situation where it becomes very hard to maintain adequacy in minimum income. Good.
Can I ask, sorry, just a clarification question. So what is minimum income protection? What do you mean? You mean social assistance?
Yeah. Here, I mean, this is minimum social assistance. Yeah, this. Plus the addition, the other benefits that people may get when they're on social assistance, for example, child benefits. So it's about the minimum income package when you're out of work and you're not entitled to social insurance. That is what the social floor refers. Yeah. So if this knows the movie, and who's this guy? Yes. So if he's the well-meaning policymaker who wants to lift the floor and push up benefit levels, but if the ceiling is coming down on him, good. So has this been happening? That's an interesting question. And well, the picture is not as bad as you perhaps would expect. So this shows you that often minimum wages are expressed relative to median or average wages. But in this case, for the reasons for the graph I've just shown, I express those relative to the poverty level. And so in the case that living standards are outpacing minimum wage growth, you would see a decline, obviously. But if you look at the actual, what has actually been happening, so it shows you the trend between 95 and 2022, it is relatively flat. So it's not that there has been an erosion of minimum wages or that living standards have risen that fast. Now the same if you look at low wages, the P10 values relative to the poverty line. You see globally, and there's a lot of country variation, but you see globally a picture of stability, and you see that actual wage floors, because minimum wages are things on paper, actual wage floors are still much higher than the poverty, which is a good news. So where do we stand now? Looking at minimum wages, where do we stand now? We know that we have minimum wages. Those have proliferated everywhere in Europe. So almost every country now has a minimum wage. Germany was the last one to introduce a minimum wage in 2015. So except for the Scandinavian countries where actual wage floors are high because of collective bargaining, unions are still strong, there's comprehensive collective bargaining in Italy have these wages. And I think that very much also, especially in Germany, results from a shift in thinking, from the traditional neoclassical thinking to what after Carter and Kruger and all that research, the new economics of the minimum wage. There was at the time in Germany, there was a big clash between like the orthodox neoclassical economists who said this is going to be a disaster for Germany, and people say, and other people saying it's going to be okay, and in the end, it turned out to be okay. The minimum wage they introduced in Germany was a serious minimum, took a real bite out of the wage distribution, and the employment effects were not actually very better. Okay, so we know there's a lot of variation, of course, in minimum wage levels. We also know that in terms of the share of the workforce that is actually working for the minimum wage, because I just showed this because it's a major benchmark, and that in some countries is a more relevant benchmark than others. Good. They show that's from another paper. I have to move on. So how adequate are we? This is a more relevant graph. This is, I think, very important. So this shows you the situation for a single person working for the minimum wage. So single adult, no children, no partner, works full-time for the minimum wage. And the minimum wage here is that red bar. That's the level of the minimum wage relative to the poverty line in each country. And of course, the actual amounts are totally different. Poverty line in Romania is way lower than, say, in the Netherlands. People pay, they don't get the gross amount, they have to pay social taxes and they have to pay social security contributions. So the actual amount they get is a bit lower, and sometimes they get additional benefits. But if you look at the diamond-shaped thing, this marker, that shows you the level net income of a minimum wage worker who is working full-time. And so you see the good news is that in countries where minimum wages are high enough and people are not too heavily taxed, that in theory they have a living standard above the poverty, even way above the poverty. And you can see here is Greece, here is the Netherlands. The Netherlands is an example of a country that has a relatively high minimum wage and also a perfectly functioning, well-functioning labor. The employment rate in the Netherlands is 81%. Long-term unemployment is extremely low, so you can perfectly have a relatively high minimum wage, an adequate minimum wage, and well-functioning. That's not everywhere the case, obviously. If you look at France and Greece, also have relatively high minimum wages. Labor markets that's well functioning. And so again, it's not because it's possible in one country that can automatically be transposed.
So what?
Right?
Which years are they?
2021. Now the picture totally changes once you start looking at people who have dependents, who have dependent children. And this shows you the picture for a single parent. Single parent working full-time for the minimum wage. Hard enough as that is. Imagine being a single parent that to work full-time. This does not take into account child care costs and transport costs and so on. But you see here, a bit of an animation in this one. I didn't do it. That if you look at the level of the minimum wage relative to the poverty line, the minimum wage is in most countries except a few exceptions, at least on paper in Romania, perhaps in Greece, the minimum wage is everywhere way below the poverty. So even the poverty line or the minimum wage will not do the job. Having a sufficiently, for single persons, having a sufficiently high minimum wage does the job in terms of protecting these people. In terms for a single family, it's not. So they need additional benefits, and there are countries, again, look at a diamond-shaped thing, shows you where the net income is. So where there is a will, there is a possibility. We have a couple of countries where that diamond-shaped market is above the poverty line. So these are the countries where, at least in theory, on paper, minimum income protection is high enough for people in this situation to stay out of it. And that is basically done through a kind of a layered approach. And that's also going to be the message coming out of the book. There's not a single bullet if you care about adequate minimum incomes. You basically need a layered approach. I sometimes call it the lasagna. You need several layers. You need adequate minimum wages. You need universal child benefits. And then you need all kinds of other income supplements. And these taken and together can create a situation where minimum income protection is, at least on paper, adequate. And so you see, in the countries that do well, you have a variety of income supplements. Some of them more universal, some of them more targeted, that bring these people, at least in theory, off. Good. All these components I'm not going to discuss, and please don't ask me questions about your own countries. I will not be able to answer them. And so, by the way, this is all that information is drawn from Euromod. So I guess many of you are familiar with Euromod, and there is an add-on tool which is called HOT, and that basically allows you to draw, building on that information that is in Euromod, allows you to draw information for these model family types of use. Good. So out of work, then it becomes far more problematic. So let's now look at what the situation is, and remember the very first graph I showed, where you had all these minimum income benefits for people who are out of work, way below the poverty, coming back to that situation. And what you see here is that countries are ranked by the level of minimum income support they provide to a household or a single person, in this case, out of work. And that's marked by this round thing. The arrow shows you the level of minimum income support provided, or minimum income of a person working working for the minimum wage. And you see the higher up, so this bar shows you the difference between net income in a minimum wage job and net income when you're out of work and living in social assistance. You see, the higher up you go, the smaller, by and large, the smaller the gap becomes. And that's very important because policymakers are very concerned with work incentives. They're very concerned, if you listen to the political rhetoric, they're very concerned with being out of work and not paying more, or being in work paying substantially more than being out of work. And you see that even in the countries that are the most generous, and the Netherlands here is the only country that comes close to bringing a person out of work, living on social assistance, to the poverty line. But you see again, the gap here is not that big. So to increase this level without increasing the minimum wage, or at least increasing the net income at the minimum wage, of course you can keep the minimum wage steady, but through in-work benefits and tax credits and so on, you could potentially lift the net income for a minimum wage. But there is a real problem there. And that's even more the case if you look at single parents, where work incentives are perhaps less of concern than in the case of single people without kids. And you see again that picture of these incomes being way below the poverty line. But if you are concerned about work incentives, there are perhaps also limits to what you can do, unless you simultaneously also increase the net incomes of people in work. And of course, you can imagine now it becomes far more expensive than the half or the 1 or 2% of GDP. And you would basically have to lift the whole income. So, by the way, another graph perhaps that shows you when you think about these work incentives, people in this situation, that is really a small minority of the population. We're talking about what's the percentage of people on social assistance, ranging from half, 1, 2, 3, 5%, perhaps of the total working age population. The same for minimum wage workers. But once you start moving up, and you want to push up your social assistance level, you want to push up your minimum wage level, given the density, you have very few people on incomes in this range, but that goes up very fast. Once you start pushing up, try to push up the minimum wage and social assistance levels, and then work incentive become far bigger problem. At least it will potentially affect far more. So, is there scope for incremental improvement? So, I said one big lesson is that wage force set at the higher end of the currently workable levels can provide adequate incomes to full-time working single persons, as we have seen, and allow for near adequate, not in a few cases totally adequate, near adequate social assistance or minimum income protection or minimum incomes for those out of work. But for low-paid earners with children, you always minimum wages, even very elevated minimum wages, will never do the job. So then it comes to the eternal issue, and I think in social policy, it's something that a lot of people in this building have thought about. And so, what is the optimal way of providing that additional income support, and what is the right balance between targeted support and universals? That's the picture of Julian LeGrand. Somewhere in this picture, of course, has famously argued that universal benefits are very, very wasteful. It was the book of the 87, not only the poor, I think. Yeah. And of course, on the other hand, you have Coppi and Palmer and people, the paradox of universalism say that targeted benefits for the poor are destined to become poor benefits. There is a huge literature and time thinking about that. So, targeted income supplements can of course take many forms. They can come in the form of additional child benefits, housing and heating allowances, childcare allowances, and so on. And we know that there are big disadvantages. And so we know that these are hampered by, again, often very cumbersome application procedures resulting in substantial non-take-up, in delayed payments. There is a lot of administrative cost and complexity, and that is, of course, very much illustrated. Am I allowed to call the universal credit the first stage of disaster? But the idea of the universal credit was basically to do real-time targeting. And to every 2 weeks, the benefit would be adjusted to the changing household situation, to incomes. And there was, I think, a big belief in the capacity of ICT nowadays and big data, and we have all these marvelous computers that can do zillions of calculations in a second, and it would all be okay. And we know that a lot of people have done research on that that it didn't quite work out the way people were, what the original plan was. And there's of course a problem of work incentives and phase out. So if you have targeted benefits, yeah, you don't want people to face cliffs in terms of work incentives. You want to phase out that is optimal so that people will lose part of their benefit when they work more, when their income increases, without them feeling totally punished for working hard. Less targeted alternatives have big advantages. As we know, if you think about universal child benefits, quite a number of countries have universal or quasi-universal child benefits, which have big advantages. And in some countries, if you would look at the model of family type, these amount to even 20% of the poverty. These can be quite sizable. Poland, for some reason, there's a good reason for that. It's a bit of an outlier there. And so the big advantages are, of course, that they provide immediate direct income support. And it is not very complicated, cheap and easy to administer. You don't, apart from income effect, it is not given to people in work, people out of work, so they're not distortionary in that sense. And also very important because sometimes in the literature, in the academic literature, you have a set of people who focus very much on the technical issues, what economists often tend to do, and forgetting or not paying enough attention, I think, to the political economy issues and what there is a big difference between what works on paper, what is perhaps optimal on paper, and what is also politically feasible and what is politically viable. Different thinking. But we know that universal benefits tend to enjoy a strong and robust political support once they're in place, which is I think very important. For countries that have universal child benefits once they are in place, and you have the middle class on board, these become very hard to abolish or even to let them erode. There's a lot of uproar whenever they kind of erode in value. So I would argue that's basically what I would, that's the conclusion I've come to, that you need a degree, that you basically need targeting within universalism. That you need an important universal layer, and then on top of that, you need targeted supplements, too strongly targeted. I feel obliged to plug this special issue. It's a special issue by Janet Garlick, Laurie Maldonado, and Amanda Shealy. And they have this great collection, so I feel obliged to plug that to make them happy. Also because there's an article here. Thomas, Thomas, that I'm not going through that, but tries to argue that targeting within universalism, that the most generous packages are follow that principle of targeting and universalism. Good. I have to come to a conclusion, I see, so let's do that. So my simple recipe would be set wage floors as high as the labor market can take without adverse employment effects, and I should add here, the EU has taken a very important step here. So in November or this October of last year, the minimum wage directive, which is hard law, and that was a first, that I think is a very clear illustration of how much thinking at the EU level has shifted, that they managed to adopt, and again, for something like this to be adopted, all the member states have to sign up to this, to have a minimum wage directive that basically says all countries need to institute minimum wages, even at the level of 50% of the average or 60% of the median, and they have to move, or they have to move towards 80% of coverage by collective bargaining. I mean, those are quite ambitious, even if it will take time for this to materialize. And I know that there are legal scholars that doubt that it will have much bite, but the fact that the EU has instituted this, I think, is very meaningful. Of course, you need to ensure a periodic operating. Operating is very important when it comes to minimum income and schemes, because you can introduce a generous or some scheme at a certain level. If you don't have a good operating mechanism, almost an automatic operating mechanism, the risk is that it will erode after a while. Have quasi or universal child benefits as a first layer of supplementary support, and then have income targeted supplements of various kinds, differentiated by, I think, especially by housing situation and by children's. But that's my kind of my simple Italian recipe for better minimum income. And now one more slide, and then I'm finished. Perhaps some further discussion points, but very briefly, that is pretty obvious. As I said, worker discretion, there's again a balance to be struck. On the one hand, of course, you want people to have legal entitlements, that you want to in paper that they are entitled to a certain benefit. But exactly under what conditions and what determines eligibility, we know from experience that it is impossible to capture all situations of need, of potential need in rules. And in the best case, you have a person sitting in front of you who recognizes that you are in urgent need, and that if you don't give that person a benefit now, that they will get in very real trouble. Of course, discretion can also cut the other way, where a person says, you're not trying hard enough, you're not working hard enough, you're lazy, etc. But there's a balance that has to be struck. Do not obsess about control. Can have a long discussion about that. So politicians often tend to think that if you give people a benefit, especially social assistance, that you need to monitor them tightly, that you need to sanction them when they don't show up for an appointment, when they don't take up the training program they're assigned to, and so on. The Netherlands is interesting because they, in their law, they have provisions that allows for experimentation, and they've made full use of that, in the sense that they have done experiments where people on social assistance in some municipalities, in some communities, again, randomized trials, of course, people were randomly assigned, and some of them were basically left alone. Some got the usual treatment, and others got a harsher treatment, constantly monitored and sanctioned, blah, blah, blah. And it didn't make that much of a difference. Even the indications are that the people who had a bit more freedom in terms of making exits did a bit better. Again, the sample sizes were fairly small, but if you look at they still did it in 5 or 6 different municipalities, so that adds up. And it's not very clear that much more control yields better results. Integrated systems work better on paper than in reality. Of course, on paper, there's a very good argument to be made to have systems that integrate a system that, by that I mean systems that provide both for people out of work, people in work. And often there's a distinction between in-work benefits and out-of-work benefits. And there's a good case to be made to integrate. It is one scheme, it's one administration. It's far clearer what the work incentives are. But the experience also shows that people in work hate to stand in welfare. There's been the German experience with Arbeitsplatz. Thomas, help me. Which was an integrated system, so provided both unemployment assistance or assistance benefits to people who were unemployed, but also people who were in work and didn't make enough and were entitled to a top of the $11.
Well done.
Thank you. I'll always so state as a real joy in the audience.
I'm not the only one.
But the experience there was that people were often too proud to people in work to apply for those benefits. It's been the same experience in France, where they had the RSA with solidarité active, which also had both components also for people out of work in work, and they've moved away from that. They now moved to PIN d'emploi. Again, separating those systems. Also because there are issues with non-take. And then I would say finally, I don't think that fiscalization of income protection is the way forward. So there was a time that some people were advocating for more EITC type the income tax credit that exists in the US, and where it has clear advantages, but I'm not sure that that is the way forward. But I'm going to end